Ever since data down actions up appeared in the Ember community, there's been a kind of pressure to move away from using anything that relies on two-way bindings, including things like the input helper that ships with Ember. Patterns like data down actions up are easy to take to the extreme. So today, I want to look at some code and see how these two different approaches compare. We're going to be looking at this form right here, which is pretty simple. It takes a name and a social security number. And if I pop open the inspector and go to data, we'll see that we have one user in the system. And if I come here and change the name, we can see that that data is bound to the name property on our user model. And same with the social security number. And similarly, if I come here and change the name to John Smith directly on our Ember data model, we can see that that updates the rendering of our form field. And same for the SSN. So these two things are bound to each other. And if we come over to the template, that's exactly what we'll see. We have some markup here, and then down here we see the input helper being used to bind our model's name. And then we see it again right here being used to bind the social security number. And so these input helpers are doing just what we expect. But we have a problem. If I come here and enter 9 digits for the SSN, well, I can just keep adding digits. But social security numbers only have 9 digits. So it's a problem that I can enter more than that. And this is an example where the two-way binding between the text in the input tag and the property on our model is no longer what we want. Instead, we want to intercept the data from the keyboard event and then decide on our own whether to update the model and how to update the model. So let's do that now. We'll come back to the template and we'll just change this input helper to a normal input tag. And we can set this value to anything we want. But we still want to bind it to our user's SSN, and we can do that with handlebars. We'll just pass in model.ssn. And now if we find our user again and set the SSN here, we'll see that the template re-renders. And let's go ahead and come to our route where we're creating this user and just start them off with a default SSN right here. So we can see that the rendering of our form is correct. But now if we come and type here, we don't see the changes reflected back in our user model. So let's come back to the code and fix that. What we need to do is handle the onInput event. So whenever this event fires, we can just call a new action and we'll call it update SSN. Now let's go ahead and make a controller to define that action. And let's just put a debugger here to see what this looks like. So if we come here to our social security number and type, we hit our action. And if we check out arguments, we can see that the first one is the input event that was fired. And that event has a target property, which is the actual input DOM element. And that DOM element has a value property, which we can use to get the actual value that was typed in by the user. So we can define the event as an argument, and we can get the value from event.target.value. And then let's go ahead and grab our user, which we can get from the model property of our controller. And then we'll just call user.setSSN to the new value. Let's open the inspector again and find our user. And now if I come here and type in the input field, we see that the user's SSN is being updated. And I can still change the user's SSN directly, and it'll re-render the form field. And so now we've basically recreated our input helper using data down actions up. So the data down part is right here, where the data from the user's SSN is flowing into the input field. And the actions up part is this part. Whenever there's an input event, we handle that with an action, and the logic in our controller causes our model to be updated. So this is the data down actions up pattern. But we still have our bug from before, because if we look at our user, we're still able to enter more than 9 digits. And that's because the action in our controller is just this naive action that takes the value directly from the input element and sets it on the user. But now we can perform more complex logic here. So we can say if the value's length is valid, so if it's less than or equal to 9 digits, only then do we want to set the user's social security number. And just to mention, there's definitely validation libraries that are designed to help build these kinds of interfaces, but I'm just using this as an example. So let's save this and give it a shot. Now if I enter more digits, we can see that I'm able to do so, but it's actually not updating the user's SSN. And if I go back down below 9, then it does start updating it. So that's good that the actual data is not getting into an invalid state, but we have this new problem where our text field can get out of sync with the property on our model. The model property is the source of truth, so if we had some way to re-render our input, then everything would be okay. Well, there is a way. We can use a method on our user called notifyPropertyChange, and we can notify any listener that the SSN property may have changed. So let's save this and try it out. We'll open up our user. And now if I hit more keys, the input isn't changing and neither is the user. But I can still delete these and add them and everything stays in sync. And if I come in here and change this directly, we also get a re-render. Alright, so everything seems to be wired up correctly. Let's keep improving our SSN input field. Now it turns out that our user model actually has a computed property called formatted SSN. And this will take the 9-digit SSN and add hyphens in the appropriate place. And that would be nice to display in our input so that when the user's typing it in, they don't have to think, okay, should I enter a hyphen here, here, and so on. So let's come back to the template, and in the data down part of this second input, instead of displaying the SSN, we'll just display the formatted SSN. Alright, and now we can see that even though the user's SSN is just these numbers, in our input we're getting these dashes. So the input is actually rendering that computed property. Now we actually have a new problem, and that's that we can't hit the backspace key, even though we only have 9 digits in our social security number. And that's because these new hyphens are taking up spaces, and so the length of this value is 11, which means that we won't pass this logic right here. So let's come up here and just do a quick refactor. We'll just create a new SSN variable, and we'll start with the value, and we'll just use replace with a regex that will find all of the hyphens in the string and just get rid of them. And then we'll check that for a length of 9. And if it satisfies that condition, we'll go ahead and update the user. So now we have the computed property being displayed, but I can actually delete these numbers. And it still prevents me from entering more than 9 digits. And if we were to start out with a blank input, then we see the computed property kind of just adds these hyphens for us. So this is pretty cool. And this is why data down actions up is so powerful, because it gives us a space to perform any data manipulation we want on the underlying raw event before we decide to commit any side effects in our application. Two-way bindings makes an assumption about what side effect we want and that assumption doesn't always turn out to be exactly what we need. Let me take a minute to draw out a diagram, because I think visualizing the data flow can really help cement this idea of data down, actions up. So we have our user data right here, and we have our field down here in the UI. And the user has the SSN property, which is feeding into the formatted SSN property, which is going down into our input field. And so this whole thing right here is the data down part. And then when the user inputs, the DOM sends up an event, an input event, and then we get to handle that with a function. And that's where we're using our update SSN function right here. And this is the opportunity where we have to perform some business logic on this raw event. And then ultimately we decide to take that transformed data and set it back on the user. And this is the actions up part. So you can see that anything that changes the user will cause the data to flow back down into our rendered UI, which is why it stays in sync with the user model. And this abstraction around how the data is presented and what we do with the action is really the power of data down, actions up. We have an opportunity to control the side effects and exactly what is presented. Okay, so because data down, actions up is so great, let's go ahead and switch over our user input to use it. We'll come up here and just like before, we'll switch this to just a normal HTML input tag. We'll bind the model's name to its value. And then we'll go ahead and add on input, and we'll call an action. And we could create a new named action on our controller, but in this case, we just want to take the value from the input and set it directly as the user's name. And there's an easy way to do this in the template, just using the mute helper. So the action that we want to fire is to mutate model.name. And if you'll remember down here, the argument to the actions that we attach to these raw DOM elements, that argument is actually the raw event. And that's not what we want to set on our user. We want to grab the event.target.value. And we can actually use this value property to destructure that event argument into the target and then the value of that target, so that the text in the input is what's actually passed to this mute helper. So with any luck, this input should be bound to our user's name property. So if I come find the user, type in Sam, the template re-renders, and if I enter more text here, we see the user updates as well. So we've managed to recreate this part of our form using pure data down, actions up. But this time we're just doing a pure pass-through of the value of the input and not using any explicit action. We're just doing a direct mutation of the model name property. So let's come back and draw this diagram out. So in this case, we have our user right here, and we have our name input. And the data down part is just grabbing the name property and sending it directly to the input. The actions up part is just basically setting the name property equal to the value of the input. And so we still have data down, actions up, but we're not really using these points of abstraction to perform any additional logic like we were over here in the SSN case. So this is still data down, actions up, but it's more of a direct pass-through. There's that bound relationship between the actual value of the user's name and the actual value of the DOM input. So the question is, Do you think changing our name field from the input helper to data down actions up improved this code? I think there's a strong argument here that it didn't. If I look at this template, I see that both the value and the onInput attributes are customized. And so now I need to look at both of these pieces to understand how this form field works. Now let me bring back the version that uses the input helper. With this version, I can just look and know exactly what's going on. This API is very succinct, and I know just by seeing this helper that this part of the form was intended to directly modify this property on the user. And now if I need to copy this part of the form and use it elsewhere in my application, I'm less likely to make a mistake and maybe forget the value part or the onInput part. And that's because all of the functionality I need is wrapped up nicely inside of this input helper with the single value attribute. So what if I get a new requirement in the future that makes it so that I can't use this two-way bound input anymore? Well, I can easily decompose it into the data down actions up version, just like we did with the social security number. So I really think of this input helper as a pre-wired data down actions up component that mutates the value with whatever's in the text box. It's sugar for that default use case, and whenever the need arises, we can easily desugar it down and get complete control over what's rendered and what side effect we want the event to have in our system. Using data down actions up gives us more flexibility. There's no question about it. But as we've seen, it's also more complicated. We have to define the right event. We have to destructure the data from the event. We have to define an action to handle the event. And if you don't need any of that flexibility, there's no reason to pay that cost in complexity. It doesn't give us any benefit over Ember's built-in input helper. So hopefully you can see that the input helper is not fundamentally misaligned with the data down actions up pattern. In fact, it should really be seen as sugar over a common use case for a form control, one that's pre-wired to directly mutate a passed-in value. And just because the input helper uses two-way bindings doesn't mean you shouldn't take advantage of it. It's a succinct, expressive primitive that every Ember developer understands, and importantly, it decomposes into its more powerful version whenever you need more flexibility. So, data down actions up is a great pattern when you need more control over your form's side effects. But if you don't, stick with the input helper, make no apologies, and get on with your work.